The doors of the luxury hotel flew open so hard that several guests near the entrance turned at once. A young woman rushed inside. She wasn't walking. She wasn't running normally. She looked like somebody trying to outrun a nightmare. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands shook. Every few seconds she glanced back toward the snowy Anchorage street as if she expected someone to come through those doors at any moment. Near the entrance stood Scot. The billionaire had just finished a private business dinner upstairs. He was preparing to leave when the woman suddenly changed. Direction, straight toward him. Before Scot could step aside, she moved behind him and grabbed the back of his coat. Not hard, just enough to keep herself standing. Scot froze. The woman lowered her head. "Please don't let them see me." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Scot turned slightly. He expected confusion, maybe embarrassment, maybe a prank. Instead, he saw terror, real terror, the kind that doesn't come from being caught doing something wrong, the kind that comes from believing nobody will help. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman swallowed hard. "I know this sounds crazy," she said quietly, "but if they find me, tonight, everything is over." Scot studied her face. She looked exhausted, scared, but there was something else, determination, like she had been carrying a burden for a very long time and had finally reached the point where she couldn't carry it alone anymore. "Who are you hiding from?" Scot asked. The woman shook her head immediately. "I can't explain right now." Her eyes moved toward the entrance again. Whatever she was afraid of was outside and getting closer. Scot should have walked away. Most people would have. He didn't know her. He didn't owe her anything. Yet something in her voice stopped him. The woman released his coat for a second. Then she laughed nervously. A small, shaky laugh. "Wow!" Scot raised an eyebrow. "Wow what?" She looked embarrassed. "If this works, this is officially the strangest introduction I've ever had." Despite the situation, Scot almost smiled. The woman took a slow breath, then another, trying desperately to calm herself, but before she could say anything else, the hotel doors opened again. The moment the doors opened, the little bit of color remaining in, Vivian's face disappeared. She stopped breathing for a second. Not because she recognized one person, because she recognized the possibility of being recognized. Several people entered the lobby. They weren't laughing. They weren't checking into the hotel. They weren't carrying luggage. Their eyes moved around the room, searching. Vivian instinctively stepped closer behind Scot. Not dramatically. Not like someone looking for attention, like someone whose body had already learned what fear felt like. Scot noticed immediately. People can fake panic. People can fake tears. People can fake innocence. Fear like this was different. Fear like this lived in the eyes. "Vivian," one of the people called from across the lobby. The sound of her own name made her shoulders tighten. Scot looked at her, her jaw locked. Her hands trembled, yet she still managed to whisper, "Please." Just one word, "Please." No explanation, no speech, no demand, just a plea from someone who had clearly spent too much time carrying something alone. Scot made a decision. Quickly, quietly, without asking permission from anyone, he took one step backward, positioning himself between Vivian and the people looking around the lobby. Then he turned toward her as if he had been expecting her all evening. "There you are." Vivian blinked, confused. Scot continued naturally. "I've been looking for you." The searching group immediately slowed. The atmosphere shifted. A few people exchanged looks. They clearly knew who Scot was. Most people in Anchorage knew who Scot was. When a billionaire acted as if someone belonged with him, very few. People challenged it. Scot nodded toward the elevators. "Come on." Vivian stared at him. He slightly lowered his voice. "Walk." She didn't argue. She walked. The people behind them watched carefully. Nobody stopped them. Nobody called out. Nobody stepped forward. Scot escorted Vivian across the lobby with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Only after the elevator doors closed did Vivian finally release the breath she had been holding. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Vivian leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and laughed. Scot looked at her. "You think this is funny?" "A little." "A little?" She nodded. "My life is falling apart, and somehow I just got smuggled through a luxury hotel by a billionaire." Scot folded his arms. Vivian shook her head. I promise I don't usually use billionaires as furniture. For the first time that night, Scot smiled. A real smile, small, unexpected. The kind that surprised even him. But the smile faded when he noticed something. Vivian wasn't relieved. Not completely. The fear was still there, which meant one thing. Whatever had chased her into that hotel lobby wasn't the real problem. The real problem was much bigger. And somehow Scot had just stepped directly into it. Have you ever been afraid to tell the truth because powerful people might be listening? Have you ever carried something so important that staying silent felt safer than speaking? Because Vivian's fear wasn't about being caught. It was about what would happen if the truth finally came out. And what Scot didn't know yet was that her secret was connected to a world he knew far too well. At that moment, neither Vivian nor Scot understood how much their lives were about to change. One was carrying a secret she had spent years protecting. The other was standing at the edge of a truth that could shake. Everything he believed about the people around him. A frightened young woman had just hidden behind a billionaire. That alone was unusual. But the real story wasn't about fear. The real story was about courage. Because sometimes the person who looks the most afraid is actually the bravest person in the room. And sometimes the people with the most power are forced to choose between protecting their comfort and protecting the truth. Let me ask you something. Have you ever known something that could change everything if it became public? Have you ever stayed quiet because speaking up felt dangerous? And have you ever wondered whether the right person would stand beside you if the truth finally came out? Tonight's story is about exactly that. A young woman who refused to surrender her dignity. A billionaire who discovered that wealth cannot protect a person from their conscience. And a secret that connected both of them in a way neither expected. Stay with us until the end because what Vivian reveals will force Scot to make a choice that could cost him far more than money. And what begins as a moment of fear inside a luxury hotel lobby will become a story about truth, courage, justice, and a kind of love built on respect rather than status. Before we continue, take a quick moment to support the channel. If you enjoy stories that inspire, encourage, and remind us that character matters more than wealth, please hit the like button. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every like, comment, and subscription helps YouTube recommend these stories to more people around the world. Now tell us in the comments, what city, state, or country are you watching from? We love seeing where our love, money, and secret family is joining us from. Let's take a brief moment to pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of another day. Thank you. For every person listening right now, please give strength to those facing difficult situations, wisdom to those making important decisions, and peace to those carrying heavy burdens. Help us choose honesty over fear and kindness over judgment. May we never lose hope even when life feels uncertain. In your name we pray. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. And if you've been with us before, welcome back. This story reminds us that fear does not always mean weakness. Sometimes fear is simply courage waiting for the right moment to stand up. So get comfortable, because Vivian's story is only beginning. And the reason she ran into that hotel lobby may be far more personal to Scot than either of them realizes. 2 weeks before Vivian hid behind Scot in that Anchorage hotel, she was standing behind a small counter at work, rubbing her hands together and pretending her fingers were not cold. You good? Someone asked from nearby. Vivian smiled without looking up. I'm excellent. My hands just filed a complaint with Alaska. She kept working anyway. That was Vivian, tired, cold, underpaid, but never empty of humor. She had moved to Alaska telling herself she needed peace, distance, and a fresh start. What she found was long workdays, quiet evenings, and a kind of loneliness that made her miss home in ways she refused to admit out loud. Her apartment was small, 1 table, 2 chairs, a second-hand couch that made a tiny sound every time she sat down. Vivian called it the choir chair because it always gave a little testimony. At night, she heated simple meals, checked her bills, and whispered, Lord, we are budgeting with faith and tap water. Still, she did not complain much. Back home, she had been raised around women who believed you could cry, pray, cook, correct somebody's bad manners, and still make a joke before the food got cold. Vivian missed that. She missed loud family cookouts. She missed church aunties saying, "Baby, eat something," even after you had already eaten twice. She missed people who noticed when your smile was working harder than your spirit. In Alaska, people were polite, but polite was not the same as knowing you. One evening, while folding her work jacket, Vivian's phone rang. She looked at the screen and did not answer. A few seconds later, it rang again. She stared at it. "Nope," she whispered. "We are not doing emotional gymnastics tonight." The call ended. Vivian exhaled and set the phone face down. Whatever she had left behind, she had no plans to invite it into her new life. But peace does not always stay where you place it. A message came through. Vivian ignored it at first, then another. Her smile faded. She picked up the phone slowly. The message had only one sentence. "We know you're in Anchorage." Vivian stopped moving. The room suddenly felt too quiet. She read it again. This time her hands were not shaking from the cold. Vivian did not sleep well after that message. By morning she had convinced herself she was overreacting. "Maybe Anchorage has another Vivian," she muttered, tying her work. "Shoes. Maybe this is a wrong number nightmare with Wi-Fi." But deep down, she knew better. At work, she tried to move normally. She greeted people. She handled her tasks. She smiled when necessary. But every time the door opened, her eyes moved first. A woman asked, "Are you Vivian?" Vivian's fingers tightened around the pen in her hand. "Yes." The woman smiled politely. "I was told you might know where the manager keeps the delivery forms." Vivian let out a breath so slowly it almost hurt. "Oh, yes. Forms. Wonderful. Normal human paperwork. I love that." The woman gave her a strange look. Vivian cleared her throat. "Sorry. Long morning?" By lunchtime, she noticed more. A car outside stayed parked too long. Someone she did not recognize asked too many questions near the entrance. Her phone buzzed twice from a blocked number. She did not answer. When her shift ended, she walked home a different way. Not fast, not obvious, just careful. That was the part that made her angry. Careful did not feel like living. Careful felt like being pushed back into a life she had already escaped. Inside her apartment, she locked the door, leaned against it, and whispered, "Vivian, you did not come all the way to Alaska to start." Acting like furniture with a pulse, she almost laughed. Almost. Then her phone buzzed again. This message was shorter. "Stop hiding." Vivian's throat tightened. She stared at the screen for a long time. There was proof tucked away that certain people wanted buried. Proof. She had promised herself she would never touch unless she had no choice. But the message meant something important. Someone knew where she was. Someone knew she had not forgotten. And maybe someone believed fear would make her hand over what she had carried for too long. Vivian walked to the small kitchen table and opened the drawer. Her hand hovered over an envelope hidden beneath old receipts and folded bills. She did not pull it out. "Not yet. No," she whispered. "I am not running because somebody sent me a scary little text." Her phone rang again. Blocked number. Vivian let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then she silenced it, but across the quiet room, her own breathing sounded too loud. For the first time since moving to Anchorage, Vivian understood the truth. She had not disappeared. She had only been harder to find. By the time Vivian reached the luxury hotel in Anchorage, she was no longer thinking clearly. She had only one thought. Get inside, get around people. Do not let them corner you outside. The cold had touched her cheeks, but fear had done more damage than the weather. Her breath came fast as she pushed through the hotel doors and stepped into a world that looked too expensive for panic. Guests turned. A few stared. Vivian barely noticed them. Her eyes moved across the lobby until they landed on Scot. He stood near the entrance in a dark coat, calm, polished, and completely unaware that his quiet evening was about to be interrupted by a woman who had run out of options. Vivian moved behind him before courage could change its mind. Her fingers caught the back of his coat. "Please don't let them see me." Scot turned slightly. His voice stayed low. "Who?" Vivian swallowed. "I can't explain here." The doors opened again. Vivian's body tightened. Scot saw it. Not drama, not performance, fear. He looked toward the entrance, then back at her. "Stay close." Vivian blinked. "That sounds like something people say right before life gets worse. Do you want my help or not?" "I'm standing behind you like borrowed furniture, so yes." Scot did not smile yet, but something in his expression softened. When the people entered and began scanning the lobby, Scott stepped, in front of Vivian with the kind of ease that made others hesitate. "There you are," he said, turning toward her like she belonged with him. Vivian caught on quickly. She lifted her chin just enough to play along. "You found me?" "Elevator," Scott said quietly. "Bossy," she muttered. "Alive," he replied. "That is a fair point." They walked together, not too fast, not too slow. Vivian forced herself not to look back, though every part of her wanted to. When the elevator doors closed, she leaned against the wall and pressed one hand over her chest. For several seconds, only her breathing filled the small space. Scott watched her carefully. "You're hurt?" "No." "You're sure?" "I'm scared, not fragile." "I didn't say fragile." "You looked it." The elevator rose. Vivian shut her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "I know this looks bad. It does. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Luxury Coat." "Scott." She looked at him. "What?" "My name is Scott." Vivian nodded slowly. "Vivian." The elevator stopped on a quiet floor. Scott led her into a private lounge area away from the lobby. It was empty, warm, and quiet enough for Vivian to finally hear her own thoughts. She looked around, then back at him. "I promise I don't usually use billionaires as furniture." This time Scott smiled. "Good to know." Vivian crossed her arms, still shaking a little. "And just so we're clear, I'm grateful, but I'm not helpless." Scott held her gaze. "I never said you were—" That answer stopped her more than the cold ever had. For the first time that night, Vivian looked at Scott not as a stranger with money, but as a man who had noticed her fear without trying to own it. The room remained quiet after Scott's last answer. For the first time all evening, Vivian wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't relaxed, not even close. But she was no longer preparing to run. That was progress. Scott walked to a nearby table and poured a glass of water. He handed it to her. Vivian accepted it carefully. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She took a sip, then another. The shaking in her hands began to settle, a little, not much, just enough. Scott sat across from her. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, he broke the silence. "Are those people still a danger to you?" Vivian looked down at the glass. "That's a complicated question." "I have time." Vivian laughed softly. "That's probably the most billionaire thing I've heard today." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Having time?" "No, saying it like you own the schedule." A small smile appeared on Scott's face. The smile disappeared when Vivian's expression changed. Whatever she was carrying had returned, heavy, persistent, refusing to leave. "You don't have to tell me everything," Scott said. "Good." "I wasn't planning to ask for everything." Vivian nodded. "I appreciate that. Most people would have demanded answers by now. Most people would have treated her fear like entertainment. Scott didn't. That made him harder to figure out. "You helped me," Vivian said quietly, "so I'll give you something." Scott waited. "I didn't run into that hotel because I stole something." "I didn't think you did." "I didn't hurt anybody." "I didn't think that either." Vivian looked at him carefully. "Why not?" Scott answered honestly. "Because guilty people usually spend their energy protecting themselves." Vivian lowered her eyes. "And?" "You seem more worried about somebody else." That answer landed harder than Scott realized, because he was right. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she released a slow breath. "I can't let certain things disappear." Scott leaned forward slightly. "What things?" Vivian immediately shook her head. "Not yet." Scott accepted the boundary. That surprised her again. No pressure, no demands, just patience. A rare thing. "You really don't know how unusual you are, do you?" Vivian asked. "Probably not." She laughed. The sound was brief but genuine. Then her face grew serious again. "I left because I thought distance would solve the problem." "It didn't." "No." "What changed?" Vivian stared at the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. "They found me." Scott remembered the fear in the lobby, the blocked calls, the searching faces. Everything suddenly carried more weight. Vivian tightened her grip around the glass. "I've been protecting evidence." Scott became very still. "Evidence. Not rumors, not suspicions. Evidence." Vivian continued. "There are people who want it gone." Scott's expression hardened. "For how long? Years?" The answer shocked him. Years. This wasn't a recent problem. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had been carrying something dangerous for a very long time. Vivian looked directly at him. For the first time since they met, she allowed him to see how serious the situation really was. Then she revealed the detail that changed everything. The evidence is connected to a group of wealthy people in Alaska. Scott's eyes narrowed. Vivian continued. And one of the names connected to it belongs to someone from your world. The room went silent, because Scott suddenly realized this situation was much closer to his life than he had believed. Target word count, approximately 450 words. Scott did not speak immediately. Vivian watched his face, searching for any sign that he had stopped believing her. She had seen that look before from people with expensive watches and careful smiles. They listened until the truth became inconvenient. Then their sympathy disappeared. Scott leaned back slowly. Someone from my world, he repeated. Vivian nodded. That is the part where most people start pretending they didn't hear me. I heard you. Good, because I'm not saying it twice for dramatic effect. Scott's eyes stayed on hers. What kind of evidence? Vivian looked toward the closed lounge door before answering. Documents, recordings, payment records. Enough to prove people were pushed out, paid off, threatened, and then blamed for the damage they didn't cause. Scott's face changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something in him tightened, Vivian noticed. You know something. I know too many people who think money can clean a dirty table. Vivian gave a dry laugh. Well, some tables need more than a napkin. What did you witness? Vivian's hand tightened around the glass. I worked around people who thought nobody like me paid attention. They talked freely, signed papers carelessly, treated workers like furniture with bills. She paused. I saw records changed. I heard names removed. I watched people lose jobs, housing, benefits, and their peace. When questions came up, the blame landed on the people who had the least power. Scott's jaw worked once. And you kept proof? I kept proof because somebody had to. Why not report it sooner? Vivian's eyes sharpened. To who? The same people attending dinners with them? The same people smiling in charity photos? The same people who call injustice a misunderstanding when the person hurt can't afford a lawyer? Scott had no quick answer. That silence told Vivian more than any apology could. She lowered her voice. I didn't run because I did something wrong. I ran because I knew what they did. Scott looked away for the first time. He could already think of rooms where decisions were made quietly. People he had trusted, people he had sat beside, people who spoke about community while protecting their own comfort. Vivian watched him carefully. Now you see why I didn't want help from a billionaire. Scott looked back at her. Yes, that honesty surprised her. He continued, but I also see why you came into that hotel tonight. I didn't come to you. No, Scott said. You came to the nearest shield. Vivian almost smiled. Don't flatter yourself. You were tall and available. Scott's expression softened for 1 second. Then reality returned. Vivian, if those names are connected to people I know, this won't stay small, I know, and if I help you, I may lose people I've known for years. Vivian stood straighter. I'm not asking you to lose anything. Scott's voice lowered. That may be the problem. His loyalty was no longer simple. For the first time, Scott understood that silence was not neutral. Silence had picked a side long before he realized it. The room grew quiet again. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that appears when two people realize they are standing closer to the truth than either of them expected. Vivian remained near the table. Scott stood by the window. Neither seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, Vivian spoke. You don't have to stay involved. Scott turned. You really believe that? Yes, after everything you've told me. Vivian shrugged. I've learned not to expect people with influence to choose difficult paths. The statement was not angry. That somehow made it worse. Scott looked away briefly. Years of business meetings passed through his mind. Years of carefully managed conversations. Years of decisions explained as necessary, practical, efficient, reasonable. But now certain details felt different. Details he had ignored because nobody had given him a reason to. Look closer. Until now. What company handled the records? Scott asked quietly. Vivian hesitated. Then she answered. The reaction was immediate. Scott froze. Vivian noticed. What? Scott did not respond right away. Instead, he sat down slowly. His expression had changed, not because he doubted her, because he recognized something. What is it? Vivian asked again. Scott exhaled. I know that company. Vivian's stomach tightened. How? Scott looked directly at her. Because years ago, my family worked with them. The words landed heavily. Vivian stared. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Scott continued. There was a woman. Vivian listened carefully. She worked around my family during that period. His voice had become distant, reflective. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't important in the way powerful. People define importance. Vivian remained silent. But she noticed things. Scott rubbed his hands together. Whenever people were ignored, she paid attention. Whenever someone needed help, she showed up. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. What happened to her? Scott looked down. I don't know. The answer bothered him a lot. She tried to raise concerns about several decisions being made. Vivian immediately straightened. What kind of decisions? Scott's expression hardened. Decisions affecting workers, families, housing support, financial, protections. Vivian's heart began beating faster. Those details sounded familiar. Too familiar. Scott continued. At the time, people said she was mistaken. And you believe them? Scott was silent. That silence answered the question. Vivian slowly looked away, not because she was angry, because she finally understood. Scott wasn't connected to this story through direct wrongdoing. He was connected through something else. Trust. He had trusted the wrong people, and because good people stayed quiet, bad decisions survived. Scott suddenly looked at Vivian. Wait, what? The documents? Vivian froze. The housing records. Neither moved. Scott's eyes widened. He was connecting pieces faster now. The company, the missing records, the woman who tried to speak, the evidence Vivian protected, all of it pointed toward the same buried problem. For the first time that night, Scott looked genuinely shaken. Vivian, he said quietly. What? I think this goes deeper than you realize. Vivian swallowed. That isn't exactly comforting. No, Scott stood. His decision was forming. Slowly, painfully, but clearly. If the truth led into his own world, he would have to follow it, even if he did not like where it ended. Scott stood in that quiet lounge knowing one thing clearly. If he walked away now, he would remain comfortable. If he stayed, comfort might never look the same again. Vivian watched him closely. So, she said, folding her arms, is this the part where you tell me you'll look into it and disappear into a mansion with heated floors? Scott looked at her. No, that was very quick, because I already decided. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Rich people decide fast when they think they're in charge. I'm not in charge of you. That stopped her for half a second. Scott reached into his coat and took out his phone. Vivian stepped back immediately. What are you doing? Canceling my meetings? All of them? The ones that involve people I can no longer pretend not to question? Vivian stared at him. You expect me to trust that? No, his answer was calm. Honest, I expect you to watch what I do. Vivian studied him, searching for the trick. There was always a trick. Help often came with invisible ropes. But Scott did not move closer. He did not touch her arm. He did not ask for the envelope. He did not demand names. He simply made the calls. Short calls, firm calls. No excuses. When he finished, Vivian said, You really just burned part of your evening because a woman you met behind your coat told you a story. Scott placed the phone down. I burned it because I should have asked questions years ago. Vivian's expression softened, but only slightly. That sounds noble. It isn't. At least you know. Scott gave a small nod. I'm not doing this to feel clean, Vivian. I'm doing it because the truth deserves daylight. She looked away. That kind of sentence usually comes right before somebody asks me to hand over proof. I won't ask. You won't? No. You'll decide when I see it. Vivian blinked. That was new. Respect without pressure. Scott continued. Tonight, you need safety. Tomorrow, you need choices. After that, if you allow it, we find the right way to bring this forward. Vivian let out a quiet breath. You talk like someone who has never had to wonder whether tomorrow was safe. Scott accepted the words without defense. You're right. That honesty made the room feel different. Vivian looked at him again. You know I still don't trust you. I know. But you're less annoying than expected. For the first time since the hotel lobby, Scott laughed softly. I'll take that as progress. It's not a compliment. It sounded close. Don't get excited, luxury coat. His smile faded into something warmer. Not romantic yet, not rushed, just human. Vivian noticed, and for once, she did not look away first. The next morning, Vivian woke up expecting trouble. Instead, she found something unfamiliar. Movement. Real movement. Not promises, not speeches, results. Scot had spent the night doing something most people in his position avoided. He had started asking questions. The uncomfortable kind, the kind that made people stop returning calls, the kind that made old records suddenly become difficult to explain. Vivian sat across from him in a private meeting room while several documents lay spread across the table. For the first time, she removed the envelope from her bag, not because she fully trusted Scot, because she trusted the facts. There was a difference. Scot carefully reviewed, page after page, payment records, housing files, internal communications. Every document pointed toward the same pattern. People with less power had carried the consequences while others protected themselves. Vivian watched him read. "You look angry." Scot didn't look up. "I am." "Good." That surprised him. Vivian shrugged. "I've been angry for years. It's nice to have company." Scot almost smiled. Then his attention returned to the documents. The evidence matched too many things he had recently uncovered. Dates lined up, records lined up, decisions lined up. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. And somewhere beyond that room, people who had relied on silence were beginning to lose control of the story. Vivian noticed the change first. Phone calls were no longer coming every hour. The pressure had shifted. Instead of chasing her, people were suddenly busy defending themselves. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she had nearly forgotten. Relief. Not complete relief, but enough to breathe, enough to think about tomorrow without fear controlling every decision. Scot closed the final document. "It's real." Vivian laughed softly. "You sound disappointed." "I'm disappointed that it took this long." The answer stayed with her, because it felt genuine, not polished, not rehearsed, just honest. As the story continues, take a moment to support the channel. If you believe truth matters more than status and courage matters, more than comfort, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who would enjoy stories like this. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if speaking the truth could cost you something important? Vivian folded her hands together. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I spent so much time preparing for people to attack the evidence that I never prepared for somebody to believe it." Scot looked directly at her. "I believe it." The room became quiet. Not uncomfortable, different, lighter. Vivian held his gaze. This time she did not see a billionaire. She saw a man willing to question his own world. A man who could have protected his reputation but chose something harder. For the first time since entering that hotel lobby, Vivian trusted him. Not completely. Trust rarely arrives all at once. But enough. Enough to stop standing alone. Enough to let somebody stand beside her, and together they prepared for the next step. Because the truth was finally moving, and justice was beginning to move with it. By the time the truth became impossible to hide, Vivian was no longer the frightened woman who had run into the hotel lobby. She still remembered that night. She remembered grabbing Scot's coat. She remembered whispering for help. But now, standing beside him, with the evidence fully verified, she understood something important. She had not been looking for a rescuer. She had been looking for one honest person with enough courage to stand beside her while she told the truth. Scot seemed to understand that, too. He did not speak over her. He did not take the papers from her hands. He did not turn her pain into his moment. When the final records were brought forward, Vivian was the one who explained what she had witnessed. Her voice shook once, only once. Scot noticed but did not interrupt. Vivian lifted her chin and continued. "These people were not mistakes on paper," she said. "They were workers, families, people who trusted systems that failed them." Scot stood beside her, quiet and steady. That meant more than any speech. The wrongdoing that had been hidden for years was finally exposed. The changed records, the unfair housing decisions, the missing protections, the payments used to silence people, all of it came into the light. Vivian watched powerful people lose the confidence they once used like armor. For years, they had counted on fear. They had counted on silence. They had counted on people like Vivian feeling too small to push back. But Vivian was not small. She had never been small. She had simply been tired. When the decision came that restitution would be made, records, corrected, and those harmed would finally be acknowledged. Vivian sat still for a long moment. Scot looked at her gently. You did it. Vivian shook her head. We did the work. I carried the proof. Yes, Scot said. You carried it when no one else would. Her eyes filled, but she smiled anyway. Careful luxury coat. That almost sounded like admiration. It was. Vivian looked down, laughing softly through the emotion. I don't know what to do with peace yet. Start small. How small? Breathe. Vivian took one slow breath, then another. And my couch survived the testimony. For the first time in years, breathing did not feel like preparation for trouble. It felt like freedom. A few weeks later, Anchorage felt different to Vivian. The city had not changed. The streets were still cold. The air still carried that sharp Alaska bite. But Vivian no longer walked like someone expecting trouble to call her name. Her shoulders were lighter. Her phone no longer felt like a threat in her pocket. The evidence had done what truth is supposed to do when people finally stop burying it. Records were corrected, families were acknowledged, restitution began, and the people who had hidden behind money and reputation were forced to answer for what they had done. Vivian did not celebrate loudly. That was not her way. She simply stood in her small apartment one morning, looked at the quiet room, and whispered, Lord, I made it. Then she laughed softly. Later that evening, Scot came to see her, not with a grand gesture, not with an expensive performance, just dinner in a simple paper bag and that calm expression Vivian had learned to trust. She opened the door and looked at the bag. If that is rich people food with leaves arranged like artwork, I'm closing this door. Scot smiled. It's normal food, defined normal, warm, filling, and not arranged with tweezers. Vivian stepped aside. Come in before I start liking you too much. Scot entered, but he did not rush the moment. That was one thing Vivian had grown to respect about him. He knew how to be present without taking over. They sat together near the small table. For a while, they ate quietly. Peace did not need many words. Finally, Scot looked at her. You never hid behind me, Vivian. You stood taller than anyone in the room. Vivian paused. The words touched something tender in her. Still, she lifted her chin and gave him the look that had saved her. Pride many times. Good, because standing behind you all the time would have ruined my reputation. Scot laughed. Vivian smiled too, but this time the humor did not hide pain. It carried healing. Scot reached across the table slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. His hand covered hers gently. No pressure, no claim, just warmth. Vivian looked at their hands, then back at him. You know I'm still learning how to trust peace. I know, and I don't need saving. I know that too. She studied him. So what exactly are you offering? Scot's voice softened. To stay. Beside you. As long as you want me there. Vivian's smile became quiet. Real. Luxury coat, that might be the best answer you've given all story. He laughed again. She squeezed his hand. Outside, Alaska remained cold, but inside that small apartment, something warm and honest had begun. Vivian had her safety back. Her dignity back, her voice back, and Scot, who once lived surrounded by wealth but starved for truth, had found something money could never buy. A woman who challenged him, trusted him slowly, and taught him that real love does not control, it stands beside. So family, if this story touched your heart, please like this video. Subscribe to Love, Money, and Secret and share it with someone who needs to remember that courage can still win. Comment below, would you have trusted Scot after what Vivian went through? Because tonight's lesson is simple. Never judge someone by how scared they look. Sometimes fear is carrying the truth. Sometimes truth needs one brave voice. And sometimes love begins when one person finally says, you don't have to stand alone anymore.